There was a lot of, just a minute ago, a lot of buzz about people getting their vaccine shot. So I hope people are getting their shots, including me. And also, of course, dealing well with this whole situation. Also, for those that are celebrating, tonight begins Tu B'Shvat, the New Year of Trees. So for those that, again, are marking that, enjoy the evening and tomorrow. I'm really excited to introduce today's program and today's speaker. Lori Gerson is the Educational Director with the International Education and Training Department of the International School for Holocaust Studies, and that is at Yad Vashem. She's also a facilitator with Echoes and Reflections, as relevant to today's presentation. And I have to say, it was Jackie Gerson who heard this program and completely impartially recommended it to us. So Lori is her daughter-in-law. I'm very happy to welcome Lori Gerson for this very significant program on spiritual resistance. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And thank you for having me here today. I appreciate your inviting me, and I'll just say hi, Mom. So we'll start with that. And I also just want to clarify, I'm not the director of education. I'm an educational coordinator at Yad Vashem. So that means I basically
I'm sorry, and
You muted.
Everyone, and it muted you even though you were spotlighted. So I apologize.
Oh, okay. So did everybody hear me say hi, Mom? That was important. I said hi, Mom. Yeah. So thank you for having me. And I was just clarifying my role at Yad Vashem. I'm not the director of education. I'm an educational coordinator. And basically what that means is I do teacher training just like I do at Echoes and Reflections. So, and I again want to thank you for having me here today. So I also want to, because this is a group from St. Louis, I do want to start off telling you a special story. So I hope you'll just bear with me for a minute. That a few weeks ago, I was actually very honored to be asked to give Yad Vashem's first ever online virtual tour of the Holocaust Museum. Of course, there were some challenges involved that had to be short, within an hour and all these sorts of things. But one of the things that I want to do is something that a story, and it's something that I always guide in the museum, but of course this is online. And so the challenge was that while I had the picture, the person whose story I was telling, I needed the documents that are in the museum to show with that. So let me just ask you this question. And I'm also hoping, I know I see everybody's on mute. I'm really hoping this will be more like a classroom today and not a lecture. So please jump in, unmute yourself. You know the trick with Zoom that if you press the space bar while you're talking, you don't have to click unmute. So you can do that, ask me questions, add to what I have to say. I would appreciate any of that. So I'm gonna ask a question. Does anybody here go to a dentist by the name of Dr. Judel Liu? That name ring a bell to anyone? Okay, so let me just tell you this story because you're from St. Louis, I have to share with you. So this is just a little bit ago that I was trying to find the documents associated with this Jew that was murdered in the Holocaust. And so the first place I went to was his page of testimony that we have at Yad Vashem, and I'm sure you're all familiar with those. Those are documents that people give in to testify about Jews that they know were killed in the Holocaust. What was interesting is that when I went to look at it, this person had 2 pages of testimony. So one of them was given in by this woman that we knew, who knew him before the war. It was a part of the story. But another one was written, you can see, first of all, I saw that it was in English. So I knew the person who filled it out was probably from the US, as opposed to Hebrew. A lot of them are in Hebrew, a lot in Russian sometimes. I saw it was in English. I looked down, it said it was his nephew, and he was from Chesterfield, Missouri. Now, people have heard of St. Louis, but I'm probably the only person out of the hundreds of people that work at Yad Vashem that saw Chesterfield, Missouri, and know what that is. So anyways, I was able to do a Google search and find out that this nephew of this person was indeed, he's still a dentist in St. Louis, in Chesterfield, and I was able to actually not just email him, but we were able to have a phone conversation. So I just wanted to share that with you. So before we get started, my St. Louis story, aside from the fact that I used to live there as well. Now, as you can see, for those of you who are not familiar with Echoes and Reflections, some of the information that I'm using today does come from their website. You should really get to know Echoes and Reflections and its website, even though it's primarily meant for teachers in the classroom. It's chock full of information, and they have really, it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. You see, it's the ADL, the USC Shoah Foundation, Yad Vashem, all joined together to create Echoes and Reflections. And so I'm going to show you here that this topic of, wait, why is it, there we go. So just to show you how the webpage works a little bit, it's going to be updated in just a few days, but it should look pretty similar and work in a similar way. You see here, you go to really easy www.echoesandreflections.org, just one word, and you'll see over here, you just press on teach. And then when you do that, there's a lot that you can look at, but one of the nice places to go is lesson plans. The timeline of the Holocaust is also excellent. When you go down, one here, but when we, oh, well, that was, sorry about that. If you would go to lesson plans, you would see that resistance does come up, and they have military resistance, and they also speak about spiritual resistance. So I apologize that I had the wrong link up there, but it's easy to find. Now, when we talk about spiritual resistance, and I don't know how much time when you guide in your museum you have to give this topic. I know in Yad Vashem, when I guide, I don't have a lot of time at all. I mean, when we teach teachers, it really is kind of almost like the meat and potatoes of what we do, because especially when it comes to educating people and educating students, there's really not much to be learned knowing that, let's say, 10,000 Jews were killed in that shooting pit over there, other than the ability of man to do evil to one another. But if we learn about how they lived during the Holocaust, not how they died, we think that's where the real lessons are. And in fact, I can show you that one of our, here, this is actually very useful, that one of our educational, one of the main things that we teach in our educational philosophy, you see here, where we have pedagogy for instruction, is teach the human story. And by teaching the human story, and there's different stories to teach, first and foremost, teaching the story of the victim. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on today. And of course, we're going to have this focus on spiritual resistance. Now, when we think of spiritual resistance, the first thing that we do think of is, you see here, I have a picture of a performance taking place. And I think what usually comes to mind when we think of the kinds of things that are spiritual resistance, and it should, and we do think of spiritual resistance of the Jews keeping up their spirits so that they could survive what they were going through, and it's definitely part of our discussion today. We're going to talk about that. But what I try to do here is bring a full range of examples, and obviously I couldn't bring them all, but I tried to bring examples from different settings as well as different kinds of spiritual resistance. Okay, and we have here the quote. This is actually from our the website of Echoes and Reflections. Roman Kent, who was a survivor of the Lodz ghetto. And we're going to see him at the end in a video. It says, resistance does not have to be with a gun and a bullet. And that's our discussion today. Now, this is a knowledgeable group, so I can skip this. I don't have to elaborate with you on the conditions in the Warsaw Ghetto and how bad they were. Also with the Lodz Ghetto, we can be reminded of how overcrowded everything was. It was the Lodz Ghetto, for example, it was hermetically sealed. 8 to 10 people lived in each room. 63% of the homes did not have bathrooms. Bread was distributed once, only every 5 to 8 days. Less than 2% of the homes were connected to gas. And 21% died as a result of starvation and living conditions. And that number probably would be higher had they not taken so many Jews out to be killed, the camps. Now, okay, so that's just, and I'm not only using the ghettos as an example, but we do have a lot of information from the ghettos. So we'll see. Now, I want to talk about spiritual resistance, maybe in a little different way, maybe through a different prism than we normally think of it. And to do that, I'm going to tell you a story to illustrate what I'm trying to talk about. Okay, so here we have Dr. Abraham Weinreb from the Vilna ghetto, and this is just, it's not him. I just showed a hospital scene from the Vilna ghetto, and maybe you know the story, maybe you don't, but what happened was in the winter of 1942 in the Vilna ghetto, there were people at that time that were ill with tuberculosis. And at that time, they actually believed that calcium would cure tuberculosis, which it wasn't, but that's what they thought. But what happened was Dr. Weinreb found himself with a whole bunch of patients and a very limited supply of calcium. And he also knew very well that it was a very slim chance, or he knew that there was no chance that there would be any more calcium coming in the ghetto. And so he had a question, and he didn't know what to do. How should he allocate, right? He has this moral dilemma of how should he allocate medicine? In other words, how should he give it out? And his thoughts were, I mean, what was he thinking? What were his two options, if we think about it? One was that he had all these patients and he could give them each an equal amount of medication. Okay, that was one option. But the other option was he could kind of go through and assess all the patients. And if there were patients who were so sick that they were clearly not going to make it, he could possibly choose to give more medication to the patients that had a chance of surviving. Okay, so this was his moral dilemma. So what does Dr. Weinreb do? He gets together a committee. He's not prepared to make this decision on his own. He gets a judge, he gets a rabbi, he gets a doctor, he gets a community leader. And he forms this panel, so to speak, and he presents them with his moral dilemma, with this problem. And this is what they tell him. The judge basically says, one, it may condemn to death only those who have committed a wrongdoing. So I can't give you an answer. That would be my role as a judge. The rabbi tells him only God determines who should live and die, not man, not myself and not man. The doctor, like Dr. Weinreb, also did not know what to do. And the community leader that he called basically said, this is beyond the perimeters of my position, meaning I can't make a decision like this. So what Dr. Weinreb does is he gives the medication to everybody in the group. And of course, what happened ultimately? They all died. Okay, but then what happens is a few months later, he has a similar problem with patients who are diabetic, and they also have a very limited amount of insulin that comes into that they have. So he assembles the same group together, and he says, "Listen, this is what I did last time. I'm asking you again, what do you think I should do?" And again, they give him all the same answers. And so this time he decides to do it the other way. He decides to give the medication, the insulin, only to those patients that have a better chance of survival. And what happens in the end? All the patients die. Okay, so, but why do we bring this story? Because the purpose of the story is not the outcome. And in this case, it's the fact that he asked the question. It's the fact that he assembled a committee. It's because why? He's presented with what we call a choiceless choice, which is a phrase I'm sure most of you have probably heard of, or all of you, coined by Lawrence Langer, a choiceless choice, right? It's a choice that nobody should ever have to make. It's where every option is terrible, and you're talking about life and death situations. Okay, so he's presented with that. And what does he do? He does basically what he would do if he were not in the ghetto. He decides to continue to be a doctor the way he would have been a doctor before. And one of the things that I'm trying to get at here and to illustrate to you is that when we talk about spiritual resistance, one of the ways we talk about it a lot at Yad Vashem in particular is this drive for continuity in a world of chaos. And so it doesn't change what becomes spiritual resistance, but maybe it gives us a different sort of prism to examine these stories through. Okay, so we're going to have that in mind as we go along. So I just wanted to start with that little introduction, so to speak. So to begin with, because we normally do think of concerts and performances, the first thing I have here are some posters that we have from the Vilna ghetto. They were found the summer of 1944 after Vilna was liberated by partisans, Jewish partisans who had been in the ghetto. They came back, and there were about 200 posters that were just literally, they gathered glowing in the wind from the streets of Vilna, so that we would have them as a record. And of course, I don't know if anybody there reads Yiddish. I don't. So I'm going to flip them over so you can see what they say in English. So here we have a concert. It's a puppet show. Starts at 9 in the evening. And here we have a whole week's worth of performances. And so first of all, we see the expanse of things that they were offering. I also want to point out something very interesting. If you see here, we have symphony, orchestra, some sort of lecture, something. He requires another symphony, but what do we have here? We have a memorial service stuck right in the middle. Okay, so again, when we talk about continuity, they're saying, and this is in the Vilna ghetto, and maybe I should have mentioned before, remind everybody that the Vilna ghetto was established after a wave of the murders, because it was in the part that was a part of Operation Barbarossa, right? The Soviet Union. So the Einsatzgruppen go out and they start murdering the Jews, and the ghettos are created in the shadow of all of these murders. And at first, they don't really know about. I mean, tens of thousands of Jews are already murdered when the ghetto is created. There's 2 ghettos, but then they quickly close one, and then it becomes the ghetto, basically workers. And then there's a period of quiet because they do need the Jews to do slave labor for them. For a little bit over a year, there's a period of quiet in the Vilna ghetto. And so it's interesting to see that. So again, even in the wave of all these murders, that's why I wanted to mention it, you see that they still take the time. This seems to be some sort of colleague of theirs, and they take the time to still memorialize one Jew who recently died. Okay, so again, we talk about continuity, and we see it right there. And I also want to bring this in the Vilna ghetto, they reported this in the newspaper. You can see here on the occasion of the 1-year anniversary of the ghetto theater. So what they're doing is they're talking about how they'd had this theater. There were around 120 performances, 38,000 people went to go see these performances. And they're reflecting back on the debate that took place when they were talking about establishing the ghetto theater. It's fascinating to see what they said. So here we have an opinion. It says, I wish to take this opportunity to express certain opinions for and against the theater. Critics say, theater, this is entertainment. In the ghetto, there's no place for entertainment. In a graveyard, you do not do theater. So again, that really it is relevant to remember that the ghetto was established after tens of thousands of Jews are murdered, and that's what they say here. But I also want to point something out. One of the people who had this opinion and was very outspoken about it, his name was Herman Kruk. Okay, Herman Kruk he ran the library in the Vilna ghetto, so he was not anybody who didn't appreciate culture. He was the head of the library. And he's saying we can't have theater in the ghetto. It's not that he didn't have an appreciation for culture. But if we stop for a minute and we think in Jewish law, right? And what do we have in Jewish law when somebody dies? We separate life from death. When somebody dies, the family sits Shiva. They remove themselves from life for that week. And then there's the first month of 30 days. And then there's an entire year of mourning. And there's different stages, obviously, and slowly the mourners re-enter life again. But all throughout that year of mourning, people, they don't go to weddings, they don't go to concerts, they don't partake in life in a certain way. And so we see that Judaism has this separation between life and death. And what we see here is Herman Kruk and some of the people who are strongly against the theater what they're trying to say, some of them do think maybe it's grotesque that we've had all these murders, how can we just go to theater? But some of them are saying, no, this is what we do as Jews. In the past, if we separated life and death, we're going to do it now as well. But then there are people in the ghetto who think, well, this is, you'll see here, it says before the first concert, and Jacob Gens, who was the head of the Judenrat in the Vilna ghetto, he very strongly believed they should have the ghetto theater. He said before the first concert, it was said that concerts should not be conducted in a cemetery. This is true, but now life itself is a cemetery. It is forbidden to be weak. We must be strong in our spirit and our bodies. I am convinced that the Jewish life being developed here, the Jewish fire burning in our hearts, will redeem us from these troubles. Okay, so he's arguing for continuity. It's the same prism, it's just a different outcome. He's saying if in the past, this is what we did, we were performers and we were people that went to performances, we should continue to do that to keep up our spirit. So it's interesting, it seems they're both fighting for that, holding on to their old world in this world of chaos. It's just a different outcome. And in the end, what do? They do open the theaters, okay? And it becomes very successful, like I explained to you earlier. Now here, I'm gonna quote what they put in the paper. It says, one visitor says that the theater is a refuge for people who wish to flee their homes, flee reality. This is true also for us. People want to forget what is going on at home. If it works out, they can even forget where they are for several hours, and that is to the credit of all the actors, illustrators, etc., who are capable of providing this refuge. So first of all, they're introducing another concept to us, this idea of an escape, okay, something I'm sure that you talk about when you talk about spiritual resistance. But there's something else I want to share with you as well. And I'm giving credit to a lecturer that comes to Yad Vashem when we were able to have seminars. Her name is Tamar Machado, and she's a musicologist. And what Tamar Machado points out when she talks about all these concerts and orchestras and performances is she points out, and if we remember, and I didn't do it with you because you know the conditions in the Warsaw ghetto, and you know they lived with on the average 7 or 8 people per room, and we know Chaim Kaplan and these scribes, you can't walk in the streets without being elbowed, and it's just horrible. And then she reminds us, she says, why would a Jew, maybe who had very precious resources, decide to spend money on a theater ticket, maybe instead of more food or something like that? And then she reminds us, when somebody like us in the days when we used to be able to go to theaters ourselves, right? If we would go to a theater and we would have a ticket and we go there and we give a ticket to the usher, where does the usher take us to? The usher takes us to our seats. Now think about that. Think about the Jews living in these ghettos, the Lodz ghetto, the Warsaw ghetto, the Vilna ghetto, the overcrowdedness in some of these places especially. Think about what it means for them, even for an hour and a half, to just sit in their own seat and have their own space. And so then maybe the idea of fleeing your homes and to forget about what's going on at home, it takes on even deeper meaning to us when we look at it that way. And I thought that was really interesting when she shared that with us, really fascinating. I had never thought of that before, so I wanted to pass it along and share it with you. Now, of course, that takes us to the performances. And here we have, these are performances from the Warsaw Ghetto. It's also important to know the source of where the pictures come from. These pictures in the Warsaw Ghetto of the performances, those actually came from the propaganda photos that the Germans were taking, which is interesting. Here's in the Vilna Ghetto. This is one of the performances they did there. They're not really sure where the pictures came from. From what I understand, they're not really sure where they came from. Because it's clear that the photographs from the Vilna Ghetto seem to be much more amateurish. So there are people that they weren't allowed to take pictures, but they were doing as much as they can. And some of these pictures made their way to Yad Vashem. You can see the difference between the professional and the non-professional. This is outside a theater in the Warsaw Ghetto, waiting in line or getting tickets. This is in the Lodz Ghetto, a children's performance. And in Lodz, the Judenrat was taking pictures. And we also know we have the 2 famous photographers of the Judenrat that were Henrik Roth and Mendel Grossman. And they were taking the pictures of real life, not the ones they were authorized to do from the Judenrat. And they were taking those pictures on their own. And we have we actually, both collections, we have the official photographs and we have some of the ones that they took on their own. And now here, I love this picture. This is from an orchestra in Lodz. And one of the things I love is, first of all, you look at their uniforms. And we talk about this idea of continuity, and this is the Lodz ghetto. I don't know exactly when the picture itself was taken, but we do know the conditions in the Lodz ghetto were horrendous. And we were talking about, they didn't just want to perform, they wanted to perform. And obviously they're not in a big theater and it's not exactly the same, but to be as similar to performing before the war as it could be. So I love that picture and I wanted to share it with you. Okay, so those are just some examples. When we're talking about this idea of continuity, another thing that I want to bring up that comes up, especially maybe if you have religious visitors that come to the museum, this is Rosa, her maiden name was Goldberg-Katz. She was also in the Lodz ghetto from the beginning until August of 1944. And she brings in her testimony, it's over 4.5 hours. I've not listened to the whole thing, but I read some of the transcripts, and you see here, she's talking about at one point or more than one point, a couple times, there's horse meat that's brought into the ghetto. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but she does talk about what happened in her house. You know, you can see, she says here, at one time they sent in some horse meat. Naturally, most of the Jews were Orthodox, that it wasn't kosher. And so she talks about this fight that goes on between her mother and her father. Mother insisted that father, my brother and I, we should eat it. But she didn't want to eat it herself. And they basically said, we're not going to eat it unless you do. And they all ended up eating the horse meat. But I wanted to focus on this. She said, and I remember that that was the main rabbi in the ghetto, called the people together. A lot of people didn't want to touch the meat and they were starved. And he told them he had a sermon. And I remember it was in the middle of a square, almost like a bank, just like a little park. And he asked the people to come there, messages go from mouth to mouth, Somehow we learned it so fast, mouth to mouth, information. Whoever could walk, whoever could get out of bed to come there, and they did. And he told them, if you want to live to eat kosher again, you better eat that horse meat. He gave them the blessing, and I think a lot of people did eat after that. And again, I think it's important to point out here that they had already made the decision to eat the horse meat. And I'm sure there were quite a few Jews that were with them as well. But if they were Jews that before would only eat something that the rabbi allowed them to, then again, we see the struggle for continuity in a world of chaos, that we need the rabbi's permission to do something that might be wrong. Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you as well. Okay, so this is interesting. Here we have a picture of laundry, right? Who would think laundry would be something that we would bring up? And here we have, this is laundry in the Lodz ghetto. This is in the Warsaw ghetto, and this is in the Lodz ghetto. And I want to show you something fascinating that I found a little bit ago when I was researching this topic. And if you look here, I'm going to blow this up for you. This comes from you can see here, American Public Health Association. And it was in 2015, this is published, Public Health in the Vilna Ghetto is a form of Jewish resistance. And I want to read to you, it's a fascinating article. You can Google it and find it. And I suggest everybody read it. It's not terribly, terribly long, but I pulled out this paragraph that I want to read to you and share with you. We describe the system of public health that evolved in the Vilna Ghetto as an illustrative example of Jewish innovation and achievement during the Holocaust. Furthermore, we argue that by cultivating a sophisticated system of public health, the ghetto inmates enacted a powerful form of Jewish resistance, directly thwarting the intention of the Nazis to eliminate the inhabitants by starvation, epidemic, and exposure. In doing so, we aim to highlight applicable lessons for the broader public health literature. We hope that this unique story may gain its rightful place in the history of public health as an insightful case study of creative and progressive solutions to universal health problems in one of the most challenging environments imaginable. Okay, so first of all, it's fascinating. They were these people conducting the study, they were so impressed by what happened in the Vilna Ghetto, by the health initiatives that they had there, that they hope it will be used as an example that people will learn from what they did and apply it if they're in a case where they need to, in places that are less privileged than other places. The other thing is, I do want to point out that when we talk about doing the laundry and these health initiatives, we also have to keep in mind that even though we're talking about spiritual resistance, we have to remember that also the underlying issue here is they want to minimize the spread of disease. So there is a very practical reason for all of these initiatives that they undertake in the ghetto. And I point that out because later we're going to see a different example. Okay, so just I wanted you to keep that in mind, but I thought that was fascinating. I wanted to share it with you. Oh, here it is. So now I'm going to take you to the Gestapo prison. In this Gestapo prison, there's a woman, her name is Gusta Davidson Dranger. She goes by the code name of Justina. I don't know if you've ever heard of Justina's, I believe it's called Justina's journal, Justina's diary. Definitely, if you can read that, she's a remarkable young woman. Her and her husband, Shimon, were very involved in the underground in Krakow. And they are, at one point, they and other young adults are arrested, and there's a women's prison and there's a men's prison, and they're taken away. Gusta and her husband Shimon, it's interesting, on the day that they're all being taken away to be killed, they both, independently, obviously, because they're in jail, they both decide that as they're being taken away, a group of them, the men decide we'll just randomly run away and at least some of us will survive. The women do the same thing. And both Shimon and Gusta, they do survive, but they don't end up surviving the Shoah. They don't end up surviving the Holocaust. But we do have here, and this is actually, she wrote her diary on toilet paper in the prison there. But we do have the testimony of Genya Meltzer, who was in the prison with her. She was a part of this escape, and she did survive the Holocaust. And I want to read what she says about Gusta in the Gestapo prison. She says here, I couldn't eat, I couldn't drink. I couldn't communicate at all with the others. I just sat along in the corner of the cell trying to regain my bearings. The natural tendency was to surrender yourself to the place, to give up your humanity. But Gusta's leadership prevented us from succumbing. Although she firmly believed that we could expect nothing but an early and violent death, she didn't let us neglect ourselves. She made us wash and brush our hair every day, as long as the water lasted, and she made certain that the table was cleaned every day. She never believed that we would survive the place, but she felt that whilst we were alive, we should behave as human beings. Okay, so a beautiful testament to this woman, Gusta, and her strength of spirit. But I bring it in comparison to the Vilna ghetto, where on the one hand, they wanted to keep up their humanity, but also they wanted to make sure that disease, that they kept down the level of the spread of disease. Here, she's really just doing it to be human. This is a true form of spiritual resistance. They were in death row. They were in a Gestapo prison, and she's still really demanding from the young women that she's with that no matter what, even if we're destined to die in just a week, that we're going to maintain our humanity. So I thought that was something I wanted to share with you. Okay. Now we're moving on, and we're going to talk about education. Okay, so again, we're back to the posters in Vilna. By the way, Yad Vashem has a wonderful educational unit using these posters. And here we go. So what we're seeing here is they're having lectures for the youth in the ghetto. There's two things I want to point out. So first of all, they're in war, and it's a labor ghetto. People are working, and look at what they're teaching. They're teaching them physics, chemistry, literature. These are, and we're going to hear from a survivor in a few minutes. We're going to watch a video where she even says it seems a little incongruous to be teaching these sorts of things in a ghetto, but that is what they teach them, and we definitely see the hope they have that these students will survive and go on to need subjects like this. But I also want to point out something else interesting. Look at what time the classes are at. 7:30 o'clock, this is at night, 7 o'clock at night, 7:30 o'clock at night. And that's because what were all of these students, these children doing during the day? They were all at slave labor. They were working. And so that's why they had to have the classes late at night. So first of all, we see the conditions from the poster, and we also see again their desire for continuity for students. No matter what conditions they're living in, they will continue with their education, even the subjects that seem irrelevant at that moment. They're going to continue. If they studied physics before, they're going to study physics again, and literature and things like that. Okay. Now, when we talk about education, we actually do have a lot of underground schools. We have courses like that. We have underground schools. And so for there, I wanted to turn to the words of the students themselves, the children. And the first quote I'm going to bring through is from Yitzhak Rudchevsky, who was in the Vilna ghetto. And he was 14. He also did not survive. He was killed in Konar with his parents. But listen to what he writes. For me, the drive to learn was a rebellion against the present. Okay, so he actually uses the word rebellion. He's only 14 years old, but he's resistant. I was determined to live in the future and not the present. If of 100 children that get on my age, 10 could learn, I had to be among them to take advantage of this opportunity. Studying has become even more precious to me than before. Okay, clearly we can tell he's a very intelligent young man who anyways loves to study, but his words are, I believe, very, very moving. Now here we have David Chirikuviak. He's 15 years old. He's also a very special young man. He also did not survive. He died from what they call ghetto disease in the Lodz ghetto. He basically just died of, or not even sure if he was sick or if it was just malnutrition. He just didn't survive. And he is actually featured in the lesson plan that we have. A lot of his diary parts of his diary are featured in Echoes and Reflections webpage. So if you want to see that, you can. You see what he writes. And he writes, tomorrow is the first day of school. Who knows how our dear school has been? My friends are going there tomorrow to find out what's cooking while I have to stay home because parents wouldn't want to go to school. I have to. My parents say they're not going to lose me yet. Oh, my dear school, damn the time when I complained about getting up in the morning and about tests. If only I could have them back. Okay, and he writes this in the very beginning, September 10th, 1939. So even before he's in the ghetto, but this is when Lodz has already, he was in Lodz ghetto, if I didn't say that, but they've already been invaded and his life has already been turned upside down. Okay, so I just love the way he writes. I mean, he writes like a kid. So I wanted to share that with you. And now we have a video. It's also on the Echoes and Reflections webpage. It's in English. It's listen and hear the words of Helen Fagan. So who was also in the Lodz ghetto, in the Warsaw ghetto, the Radomska ghetto. She was in a few. And then apparently she went into hiding. Okay, so let's hear her words about education in the ghetto.
We really had a very limited space, not only the actual living space, but actually also the limited outside space. And that ghetto was keeping us very much together in a way that it brought us together as well. We would try to establish semblance of a social life, semblance of an intellectual life. For example, there were no schools. And my younger sister was very young, and I knew that she needed education. So I established a clandestine school. And the girls would come to my room. I can't call it an apartment. And they would be in groups of five or sixes, and they would come every hour on the hour, and I would conduct classes with them, and I would spill out of my head whatever I remembered having learned in my school. And the most incongruous subject matters. I would teach them Latin vocabulary. I would teach them geography. I would teach them anything I knew. And as a matter of fact, I wrote an essay which I call Gone with a Dream, because one of the things that I read most recently prior to establishing the school was the Polish translation of Gone with the Wind. And when the girls came and they were so solemn and they were so sorrowful and they would say, please, please tell us a story. I would say, okay, today I'm going to take you to an altogether different world. And I took them away to a southern plantation in Georgia, and I was talking to them about Tara and about Melanie and about Scarlett and Brett Butler, and their eyes would open and they would dream about it. And I remember one girl especially, green-eyed girl who I would have thought would have looked just like Scarlett. I said, "Goodbye, Scarlett," and she would say, "No, I'd rather be Melanie." So we were dreaming together.
So first of all, I think it's pretty remarkable to learn that in the ghettos of Poland, they were reading and sharing Gone with the Wind. So I wanted to share that with you. But I also want to point out, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that Gone with the Wind at that time, which is why she had just read the Polish translation, it was an international bestseller. And so not only was she taking them to an escape, which she very clearly says, which is Gone with a Dream, I think is what she says, but also if we think about it, Gone with the Wind was a way of connecting with the rest of the world. In other words, if that time the rest of the world was reading Gone with the Wind, so were these girls in the ghettos of Poland. They were also keeping up with times, as if they would have read novels like that international bestsellers before. Again, they're continuing to do that in the ghetto. So I thought it was nice to share with you. Now, as we move on, sorry about that.
We read.
Okay, now this I want to share with you, this comrade, which sounds like what it means friend in Czech. It comes from the Theresienstadt ghetto, Terezin. And the comrade newspaper or periodical, I guess you could call it, was one of the publications. It was created by the children in Theresienstadt. And obviously that could be a whole lecture onto itself. But in Theresienstadt, which had characteristics of both a ghetto and a camp. So you'll hear it called both sometimes, or sometimes the ghetto camp of Theresienstadt. So there, the men and the women lived separately. And then at a certain point, the Judenrat there, the Jewish council, removed the children because first of all, they lived in these big rooms, and they didn't think it was really so wonderful for the younger children to be living with adults. And they also were making efforts to have camaraderie between the children and to have somewhat of a children's life, even though they were living in Theresienstadt and many of the children were going to work every day, just like in the other ghettos. So one of the things is that some of the homes, like this boys' home or that boys' home, they produced, one of the things they did was they produced publication. There was also a lot of artwork. There was a lot going on. They had lectures and they had underground schools for the children as well. But I wanted to share a little bit of this newspaper with you from one of the publications. And there were 22 issues that survived that we have. I want to show you something. This is they do reporting and they talk about things in the ghetto. They interview different people in the ghetto, but here they have a fun corner. First of all, I think it's kind of fascinating to see what they expected their friends to know. For example, I don't know, here, list 10 rivers in North America. Do you have students or do you know children who live in St. Louis that can list, I don't know, rivers in Europe, right? So it's amazing that they think that their friends would know things like that. Here, Ontario is a lake, city, or swamp. I mean, it's amazing. They're talking about artists and sculptors, list 5 well-known operas and their composers. So very interesting. But I want to point this out to you. Look what they say on the bottom, okay? Answer honestly without using an atlas. Well, think about that. Answer honestly without using an atlas. These children are living in a world that is anything but fair, right? Their lives, literally, the chaos they live in, their lives have been turned upside down. And one of the things that is characterized as Theresienstadt was the constant transports. In many ways, it was somewhat of a tramp camp, and they lived in constant fear. They didn't know all the ghettos, but in Theresienstadt, they really lived in constant fear of being taken away, and their friends were taken away. Large amounts of Jews were taken away at different intervals and put here. So like we say, a world is anything but fair, but they are insisting we will maintain our moral standards, we will maintain our integrity, we will maintain our humanity, even though we live in a world that's anything but human. So while we're talking about these publications, I wanted to share, if you don't know who Petr Ginz is, it's worth doing a little research on him. We have a lot on the Yad Vashem website about him, and if anybody's interested, you can be in touch with me and I can guide you to find things about him. He's a remarkable young man, and he was taken to Theresienstadt alone at the age of 14. And that was because of the racial laws that the Nazis were following. His mother was not Jewish, so his father was protected in the beginning. Eventually, at the end, he goes to Theresienstadt. In the beginning, he was protected for being married to a not Jew, and his younger sister was too young, so Peter ends up going to Theresienstadt alone. And he is the publisher, or the editor of the publication in his home that he's in with the boys, and it's called Vedem. First, I want to show you what an amazing artist he was. And he was talented in so many things. It wasn't just art. He was a writer, and he loved science, and he'd already written novels before he had even gotten to Theresienstadt. He had written many short stories and even a whole novel that he wrote, very into sci-fi, if I'm not mistaken. Super talented. And like I said, so he was the editor of the magazine called Vedem. Now Vedem, let me see if this works. So Vedem in Czech means we will lead. Okay, that's what, or we lead, we will lead, we lead. And I want to show you one of the covers that he drew for Vedem. You can see here, this is the cover he drew, and he draws a cannon. And a cannon is clearly a sign of fighting back, right? Of resistance, rebellion. But what's it made out of, this cannon? It's made out of their publication. Piece of paper that says Vedem on it. And if you look over here, these cannonballs, it's a satire, mirth, and wit. So what are we going to fight back? We're going to fight back with our words, right? We're going to, and all those things that we're going to use. And I brought out this quote that he has in one of the publications that I want to share with you. He wrote, "They tore us unjustly away from the fertile ground of work, joy, and culture, which was supposed to nourish our youth. They do this for only one purpose, to destroy us, not physically, but spiritually and morally. Will they succeed? Never. Deprived of our former sources of culture, we shall create new ones. Separated from the sources of our old happiness, we shall create a new and joyfully radiant life." Now, unfortunately, Petr Ginz, his father and little sister were eventually, they were sent towards the end to Theresienstadt, and they were there for just a few weeks together. And then Peter, because he's been there for so long, he's taken on one of the last few transports that goes to Auschwitz, and they believe he's killed immediately upon arrival at Auschwitz. So, but he's definitely well worth learning about. Really a remarkable young man. But he says plainly and clearly, we will fight back. And those are the words and images that he uses. And now we're talking about publications and writing. So one of the things that we know is there are many notes and diaries, especially, and letters. Here we have, I quoted from the woman, you see here, this book, Salvage Pages. This is a child's diary. And the editor of this collection of young writers' diaries from the Holocaust is called Salvage Pages, and she writes this about the diaries, and I wanted to share it with you. She says, perhaps most important of all, the diaries, stand as markers of people in time, those who wrote themselves into existence when the world was trying to erase their present. As such, they are tools for pedagogy, to be sure, but they are also a reminder of the singular power of the written word. Okay? When we talk about documentation, of course, we have to mention the archives, and there were more than one, but of course, the most famous one is the Oneg Shabbat. I'm sure I'm talking to a group of people that know what the Oneg Shabbat was from the Warsaw Ghetto and with Emanuel Ringelblum, but I just want to bring this here, what he says about it in his writings. He says it's in late 1942, towards the end of they're on the brink of burying the, at the end of late 1942, it's the Great Deportation, and they start to bury the three different collections of the Oneg Shabbat. And he writes, the members of the Oneg Shabbat constituted and continued to constitute a united body, imbued with a common spirit. The Oneg Shabbat is not a group of researchers who compete with one another, but a united group, a brotherhood where all help one another. Each member of the Oneg Shabbat knew that his effort and pain, his hard work and toil, his taking constant risks with the dangerous work of moving material from one place to another, that this was done in the name of a high ideal. And I wanted to share this with you because it emphasizes here the risk of life involved in so much of what the Jews recorded and they left for us to find, or they try to smuggle out of the places they were in. We have to remember that really it's a spiritual resistance. That's how we categorize it. And yet they sometimes were risking their life just as the people who were involved in the military resistance. So I wanted to bring that up with you. And we also, this is something I thought very interesting, that aside from all those different kinds of writings and keeping things, one of the things that they made sure to include when they were documenting in the Warsaw Ghetto was they did research. And here we have, for example, this is a report on the spread of typhus, for example. This is the horrible conditions of the orphanages in the Warsaw Ghetto, and I want to share this with you. These are the writings of a woman. Her name is Cecilia Slepak, and I don't know if you've heard of her or not, but again, you should look her up. But Emanuel Ringelblum commissioned her to, and he had a lot of people writing about different things, but he gave her I think she was a journalist before the war, and he gave her the job of studying, he chose a woman to study women in the ghetto and to see what he assumed would be the changing role of women with the war and in the ghetto. And what's interesting is she does manage to follow 16 women. Of course, her work is cut short because of the Great Deportation, and we lose track of Cecilia. We don't know what happens to her, so we assume, of course, that she was murdered at that time of the Great Deportation. What's interesting is that when I was doing a little research, is that women's studies as an area of academic research, the first time we have that anywhere else in the world isn't until 1956 in Australia. And in America, the first women's study course that we know that came onto the scene was at Cornell University, and it wasn't until 1969. So I point that out because here in 1941, I guess it was around there, right? Emanuel Ringelblum is not just rushing to record everything. He's also like literally, he's oh God, I'm forgetting my English. But he's ahead of his time. I mean, he's doing stuff that nobody else has done before, and I thought that was fascinating when I realized that. So really, not only was he right on target with the mission that he took with the Oneg Shabbat, but like we said, really a man ahead of his time. Okay, and with that, I just had to bring this up as long as we're talking. As long as we were talking about the Oneg Shabbat, is that humor. We talk about spiritual resistance and keeping up your spirit. And in the past, if you would make jokes about things, and so here we have a joke from Warsaw. Okay, here we know they had to wear the star. Of course, in the general government, this is what the badge looked like. It wasn't the yellow one; it was one that looked more like an Israeli flag. We see there. Here's the joke. Naleweki Street looks like Hollywood nowadays. Wherever you go, you see a star. Okay, so that was the joke that they were telling each other, and again, this ability to laugh at your situation is something that they wanted to continue to do as long as they could. And there's a whole bunch of jokes I could have brought as examples. Emanuel Ringelblum, if you read his diary, he records jokes all along the way, like really. It's really fascinating to read about that. Charity, Hitler, aside from everything else he was doing to the Jews, there was really this decree that the Jews should starve to death, if we think about it. And that in the food that they were allotted, we know in the Warsaw Ghetto, the official allotment from the Germans was 183 calories a day. And now they were able to smuggle in food, unlike in the Lodz ghetto, which was hermetically sealed. So there was that, but what was given from the top down was that the Jews basically will use them as much as we could for slave labor, but we're not going to really waste any money that we don't have to on the Jews. But what we see is truly remarkable, and they especially in the Warsaw Ghetto, there's a lot of documentation on the Island Health, the self-help group that they create, or this institution, which had started. It wasn't something new, right? They had always helped Jews that were underprivileged and Jews that needed charity, but we see that they continue even with such meager rations that they had and such little money that was coming into the ghetto. They do try to share the little food they had with the Jews that were coming, especially with the refugees that were coming in from around Warsaw, right? They brought the Jews in, about 150,000 Jews from the neighboring villages. These were refugees that ended up in these huge buildings and in schools, and they didn't even have an apartment to live in, some of them. And their effort to help others is also truly remarkable when it's studied. Rachel Auerbach was in charge of some of the soup kitchens, and there's some remarkable stuff that she has on that, and the struggle and what they did to try and at least just prolong the Jews and dying off from the conditions as long as they could. I want to take you back to David Cherkuviak, and when we're talking about charity, I also want to bring up this idea of self-sacrifice. And we'll see it in a few minutes also in the camps, so we move away from the ghettos and into the camps a little bit, but David Cherkuviak writes about his mother. She was just chosen to be taken away. This is the night before she's deported from the ghetto. She's chosen because she looks so weak. That's why she's chosen. And look what he says. He says, "My poor mother, who always feared everything, yet invariably continued to believe in God. She spoke to us about her fate. She kind of admitted that I was right when I told her that she had given her life by lending and giving away provisions. But she admitted it with such a bitter smile that I could see she didn't regret her conduct at all. And although she loved her life so greatly, for her there are values even more important than life, like God and family, etc." Okay, so here, David Cherkuviak, he's probably about 15 or 16 years old when he writes this, and he's talking about his mother and her giving away the little that she had just to help others. This charity, but also a sense of self-sacrifice. In other words, they knew and she knew what she was doing to herself when she was sharing the little food that she had. Now, I want to bring you this video. The video that we're about to see. So we're moving on to a different topic. It's religion, and of course we know there were a lot of underground shoals and brisses that were done on babies and all of these things that were done in secret. But here's something different, and I also wanted to bring you a different setting. So here's something that has to do with religion, but it also has to do with a young boy in hiding. If it's not in the ghettos, you'll see where he is. It is in Hebrew, but there's English subtitles. Okay, so you'll read along. Now, what we're looking at, I should explain to you. You see here, it says Yad Vashem, and it says the Cologne Institute of Technology. Years ago, Yad Vashem started this, I guess, partnership with the Cologne Institute of Technology, where one of the things the students can learn there is using visuals or using technology for visual communication of what you want to give over. And so it has to do with art and graphics and things like that. And they partnered with them because Yad Vashem, with other people and other institutions, are concerned with memory going into the future and the future generations and how they will relate to the Holocaust. So this is one of the efforts to reach out, so to speak, to the younger generation. Okay, so here's one of them that I wanted to share with you. It's a video.
היום אני בן 13. אני חתן הבר מצווה, ואני מוכרח לעשות הכל ולבד. בית הכנסת הוא המחילה שקריתי לי. בידיי חפרתי באדמה עיגול, ותקעתי בו המון זרדים. הרמתי מעט את ראשי, והיבטתי סביבי. לא ראיתי צל, כי צל רואים במקום שיש בו אור. אבל אני ראיתי את כולם. כל הזרדים דיברו אליי. ראיתי אותם כחוגגים סביבי. הבטתי עוד ועוד באותן מצבות קטנות, באותו המון שהיה ואיננו, ורק זיכרונם נשאר.
Okay. Now, I know it's actually, it's really very a sad story, but I like to share it for two reasons. First of all, we do see the strength of spirit of this little boy. He's turning 13 years old. He's all alone in hiding. And we're talking about looking and seeing this concept of continuity in the world of chaos. He knows it's time for his bar mitzvah, and so he's going to celebrate his bar mitzvah any way he can. So I thought that I wanted to share that with you. Also, I really think that if you, I think a beautiful tribute to the story. This man wrote his memoirs, and so all we have are the words, and you see with the introduction of the art and the music, and I think it really just makes the story that much more meaningful, even though it's a meaningful story in and of itself, but with the visuals and the sounds, it really becomes, in a way, a beautiful story, as well as a tragic one. Okay, so, okay, oh, there we have the bar mitzvah. Sabotage. You can see I have up here, sabotage. This is something I'm sure you're all aware of. If you haven't heard of Helena Berenbaum, also you should, I think I have her book, see this, I have her book right here, Hope is the Last to Die. Look at how many things I have marked off. It's an incredible book. She survived the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. She survived a gas chamber in Majdanek, and she survived Auschwitz. Okay, so she's a remarkable woman, a very well-known writer here in Israel. And so she wrote in her book, Hope is Last to Die. She wrote about being chosen for the Canada Commando in Auschwitz. And so with this group right now, I don't have to explain what the Canada Commando, who they were, you know, their job, and they had to go through all the stuff that the Jews left behind. But look what she writes about. She says, most often I worked outdoors, tearing up rags or old clothing to make sure they did not get into good things, sorted to be sent to Germany by the Nazis. So she's talking about this job they had. They were going through all the stuff that the Jews left behind, and the good stuff was supposed to go in one pile to go to Germany, and the bad stuff was going to be thrown away, I guess. But listen what she says. But I usually tore up everything that came to hand, good as well as bad clothes, so that the Nazis had as little use of them as possible. Almost all the women I worked with did the same, watching to make sure they were not observed by stormtroopers. Now, of course, why were they watching to make sure they weren't observed by stormtroopers? Because what would happen to them if they were caught taking the good stuff that was supposed to go to Germany and purposely ruining it so that Germany would get less stuff, right? They would have been killed on the spot. So this can't be categorized as physical resistance or military resistance, but we do see it is resistance. And so I put it here as sabotage. And we hear stories like this. It's not the only one we have. If they were supposed to manufacture 10, I don't know, bullets in one day, and they purposely only, and we'll actually see a video that talks about that in a few minutes as we're nearing the end here. I also wanted to share this because I think it's just so timely for the situation that we're all in now. If we're talking about Helena Berenbaum, I'm going to make it work for spiritual resistance. Okay, so she has lost at this point when she's reading this. When she's writing this, she's lost her entire family. Right, she was finally with her mother at the end and a cousin, and she lost both of them. She's completely alone in Auschwitz. Listen what she writes. There I met fellow prisoners, a Mrs. Przova and her daughter Roshka. Both began asking me questions about my past life. I told them briefly of my experiences and felt an enormous relief. They listened to my tale with tears in their eyes. Okay, so these are people, this mother, daughter, they probably have lost their family as well, but they're listening to her. They're showing so much compassion that they are moved to tears, even though they, I'm sure, have their own tragedy that they're dealing with. And when I left, Mrs. Przova stroked my head and asked me to visit them whenever I could. We will always find a way. We will help you, she said, pressing some onion and garlic into my hands. And so again, we see they're sharing food with her in Auschwitz. They just met her. In essence, she's a stranger to them. But I also want to read what Helena writes afterwards. Okay, look at her reaction. She says, I went back to the barracks as though on wings. It seemed to me my feet were not touching the ground. So light and good did I feel. They always welcomed me affectionately and warmly. And in those days, I needed affection no less than I needed food. And I want to remind you that she's in Auschwitz. She's in Auschwitz all alone. And look what she writes. I went back as on wings, right? So light and good did I feel. And I wanted to share this with you because first of all, they are sharing it in a place where it's really self-sacrifice, that they're sharing the little who they have, but also just, I think it's so timely now. You know, I couldn't help but think of this story when I woke up a few days ago. If maybe I saw the headline that in Las Vegas, they are rushing to reopen the schools in spite of COVID because of the tremendous increase in teenage suicide and children, you know, that are home feeling isolated. And we see here, even in Auschwitz, the power of just being kind and reaching out to people and showing friendship. I think it's truly, truly remarkable. And I just thought it was very timely. So I wanted to make it work for this presentation. I hope I did that appropriately. So I wanted to share that with you. When we talk about this idea of self-sacrifice, I want to show you something. This is a picture from, we could also call it or we could even call it extreme altruism. So that's what we're talking about, like risking your life to save a stranger. And we see that, especially in the camps. You see here, this is a picture from the Auschwitz album. And if you don't know what that is, we also have that on the Yad Vashem website. The Auschwitz album is a picture of nearly 200 photographs that were taken when the Hungarian Jews come to Auschwitz-Birkenau. Brand new research shows that it's from various different transports. I believe 8 of them. We used to think it was from just one transport. Anyways, I want to show you something in this picture here. And these were taken by photographers, German photographers. These are official pictures that were taken. Now it's interesting because we have visuals. But just remember that there's 2 things that we don't see. We don't have, even though we have the visuals, and it's very important that we don't hear the sound. And there's something else that we don't get a sense of necessarily from the pictures. We get a sense of the chaos, we do. We don't get a sense of the pace. And many times when we hear survivors testifying to what happened when they arrived on the ramp in Auschwitz-Birkenau, it was so fast and I was torn away and within minutes. And so we lose that with the photographs, but I do want to show you this. You see here, wait, sorry about that. Okay, look at that. I'm going to enlarge it for you a little bit. Okay, so what we have here is we have a prisoner, right? And he's talking to this woman. Now, we do not know what he's saying. I'm not pretending that we know that. He could have known her before and saw somebody he knew, but what we do know is that this is not allowed. Right, they're allowed to help the Jews. They're instructors to help them get their stuff off, but they're not allowed to, so to speak, be talking to the Jews because what might they do? They might help them. We know that was risking their lives by doing that. And so I do want to bring up an example. We don't know, the only way we know if those pictures actually are realistic and what really happened is by hearing from the survivors who were there and experienced. And one thing we do know, if you ever use any of the pictures from the Auschwitz album, is that they were what happened, but it wasn't the full story, because many times you hear about the dogs that were barking and the people who were shot on the platforms, and clearly this is what happened, but it seems to be a very sanitized version of what happened when the Jews arrived at Auschwitz. I just want to point that out. We do recommend that teachers use it in the classroom because we see the people and we do see what happened, but we have to clarify what we do see and what we don't see. But I want to bring this here because Elie Wiesel, in his book Night, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with this, but I want to remind you of this scene that could have been something like what we saw in that picture. And again, I'm not saying we know what's in the picture, but I'm using it for an illustrative purpose here. And he recalls this scene in Night. He says, here, kid, how old are you? It was one of the prisoners who asked me this. I'm not quite 15 yet. No, 18. But I'm not, I said, 15. Fool, listen to what I say. Then he questioned my father, who replied, 50. No, not 50, 40. Do you understand? 18 and 40. He disappeared into the night shadows. Okay, so here is a complete stranger. He's doing something that he could be killed for, and he's risking his life, what we call self-sacrifice or even extreme altruism. He's risking his life to save these other Jews that he's never met before. Okay, so I'm going to point that out. I think that for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead, fast forward this. I apologize. But I do want to point out something else. When we talk about the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, which of course was a military form of, very clearly a military form of military resistance, and I'm not taking away from that. But I do want to read you this quote, and it's from Anton Zuckerman, who was very involved in the underground, and he ended up being on the outside of the ghetto right when he was supposed to go back in, and the ghetto was surrounded. But he says this on Israeli radio in 1968 on the 25th anniversary of the uprising. And this is what he says. He says, I don't think there's any real need to analyze the uprising in military terms. This was a war of less than 1,000 people against a mighty army, and no one doubted how it was likely to turn out. This isn't a subject for study in a military school. Not the weapons, not the operations, not the tactics. If there's a school to study the human spirit, there it should be a major subject. The really important things were inherent in the force shown by Jewish youth after years of degradation to rise up against their destroyers and determine what death they would choose, Treblinka or uprising. I don't know if there's a standard to measure that. Okay, so he says it very clearly here. If we're going to study the human spirit, we need to incorporate the military rebellion with the resisting with the human spirit. Okay, so of course they did physically resist, but it was tied up with spiritual resistance. In fact, if you read, we do have in diaries some of the conversations that took place, and they say they use phrases. I'm sure that you've heard these, right? We Abba Kovner, we should not go like sheep to the slaughter. We're fighting for our 3 lines in history. They really weren't fighting so that the Jews would have a military victory, because they knew that was impossible. Okay, so here we have, I remember we saw Roman Kent. He was in the beginning of our discussion, and here I want to bring to you a little snippet of an interview with him. It's again on the Echoes and Reflections webpage, and here I want you to listen to his words. He sums up pretty well what we've been discussing today.
They organized, and particularly our resort was excellent to it, that we did what we would call it here in the United States like slow down strikes. When the management wanted us to do 10 pieces a day, we would do only 2. And we realized that the management would be afraid to do anything to us, because if they openly would say that, hey, you've got a slowdown strike, they would be punished by the Germans. So in a way, we were playing them against the Germans, and we are saving our lives by very low production. So I say this because in many instances, I heard so many times being said that the Jews didn't do anything. They went like a sheep to the ovens. But it's not true, because this was also a resistance. Resistance does not have to be with a gun and a bullet. As a matter of fact, sometimes the easiest resistance is with a gun and a bullet. But many times the consequences of taking a gun and shooting a German would be that they would take 100 other people and kill them. So that would not accomplish much. But a resistance like this is a resistance. A resistance when a mother gave a piece of bread to the child so that he could survive. It's a resistance. The resistance was in the Lodz Ghetto that we had symphony orchestra. And this orchestra played, and it was cold. But by playing in ghetto, they gave the people the will to live another day and another day and another day. Yes, it was maybe not legal, but it was a resistance. A teacher that was teaching the children in ghetto, it was resistance, it was illegal. So that there are many other forms of resistance, which is spiritual and moral and so on.
Okay, so those are the words of Roman Kent himself. And so with
They-
that, I want to end my discussion here. And I love the way he said, sometimes it's easier with a gun and a bullet than what he was talking about. And I'll bring that up in a minute. So to end our discussion today, nobody interrupted me or shared or had any questions, but maybe they'll come afterwards. But I'm going to end with this very famous memorial. And some of you have seen it, I hope, in person, either at Yad Vashem or in Warsaw. We have what's called the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Memorial. It was put up in Warsaw in 1948 and in Israel in 1976. In Warsaw, it's back to back. And in Israel, they put it side to side, which is very interesting to see. And I do want to point out here that if we look at the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising Memorial itself, and I'm going to make it bigger in a minute, but I want to point out it's a battle scene. There's fire raging around them, and we know that they did set the ghetto on fire when all the Jews were hiding in bunkers. And if you see here, you see that it's a statue that very much is in 3D. Right, there's this very dramatic effect where it jumps out at you. This is supposed to be Mordechai Anilevitz, one of the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And notice that these images, they almost look kind of like I think of like Greek gods, so to speak. And you'll notice him especially, look at, he's, on the one hand, he looks very strong. On the other hand, he looks emaciated. His clothing are torn. He's wearing a bandage on his arm, and yet in his other hand, he has a grenade. So really a dramatic image of injured and still fighting. And so there's clearly a message here of bravery and strength that's given over in the sculpture itself. Now I want to take a minute and look at this one. That's in Yad Vashem. It's stands right next to the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and it's called The Last March. And it represents during the Great Deportation, right, nearly, I don't know, a little bit less than 300,000 Jews are taken to their deaths in Treblinka. So that at the end, only about 50 to 60,000 Jews were left. But we have here what's called the Last March. So first of all, there's 12 Jews here. We think of 12, we think of all the tribes of Israel, so it's representing the all of Judaism, and they're being taken away to be killed. What's interesting, I also just want to point out, first of all, it's also much, it doesn't stand out nearly as much. It's a much more muted sculpture, so to speak. So I think in that sense, we're going to point out to you that maybe the bravery is there, just a little more hidden, just like the sculpture itself. We do see the Nazis in the background. It's interesting, we see only a few of them, but they're not even given any sort of human form. Like they're really as if they have no more humanity at all left in them, but we do see their weapons. That's important because these are a group of people that have no way to protect themselves against this army over here. Now, I do want to point something out. It is called the Last March. It's supposed to represent the Jews that were taken away. But I also want to point out what Roman Kent said, that he doesn't, when people, he can't stand it when he said they went like sheep to the ovens. And if we look at some of the people that we see, some of the figures in this sculpture, I want to take just a few minutes to point out a few of them and maybe give you a different way to look at the sculpture. We see here in the front, we have this pregnant woman, and we know that it was forbidden to be pregnant in the ghettos. They could have been killed. The babies, certainly, if they were found, were killed. And here, this Jewish woman in the Warsaw Ghetto is willing to bring life into the world. And look at this, she's protecting her baby up until the last minute. Okay, so to me, a woman who is bringing, I believe it's Chaim Kaplan who writes about the women he sees, the few pregnant women that he sees in the ghetto and how remarkable he thinks they are. That this here to me is a show of not only hope that you be able to give birth to this baby and save it, or that that everything will be over before the baby's born, whatever that hope is. And certainly it comes from a place of strength, because she's going to bring the baby into the world even though she's not allowed to. I want to point out here we have a rabbi, an old man who the Torah is front and center. Now think about it. They're living, he's testifying to his faith in God in what one could say is a godless world. A lot of people say that, but also he's holding on to this Torah, even though the Torah and Jew is what he's being persecuted for. So again, I think this is, for me, it's actually, I believe, an image of real strength of spirit and clinging to, as we say, if he believed in the Torah before, there's nothing that can make him not believe in the Torah and God like he did in the past. And lastly, I want to point out this figure over here, and I could talk about everybody, but I just want to finish up that we see over here. This man, he looks, I mean, we don't know exactly how old he is. He doesn't look terribly old. And he also doesn't look extremely emaciated. He looks rather in decent shape. And here he is, he's with these people, and he's holding on to this young child. And we have to keep in mind, we talked about dilemmas in the beginning, right? And choiceless choices, that it seems to us, especially the young people, they should have run to the forest, they should have tried to save themselves. But let's not forget that all of these young people, they came from families, and they came, even if they weren't parents themselves, they had younger siblings, maybe they had nieces and nephews that they were close with the way they lived. They came from a life of, a lot of them, from very strong family ties, very strong ties with their friends and their youth groups. And so many times the decision to run to the forest and become a partisan, or even to try and be hidden away and leaving your family, becomes a great dilemma that they have to struggle with. And it was very brave to run away and try to fight the Germans. It was also very brave to make the decision to stay and try to be with your family and protect them as long as you could. In fact, Abba Kovner, one of the greatest partisan, most celebrated partisan fighters that we know of, apparently until the day he died, really considered himself the man who abandoned his mother in the ghetto to run to the forests. And apparently he lived with that guilt his entire life. So it really was not an easy decision. And I think the decision to stay and try to help your family and be with them can in many ways be seen as being just as brave as the decision to run to the forest. So I think it's a good way to end what we've been talking about here. We have many different forms of resistance. I only covered a few here, and I'm sure you know a lot more as well, but I hope I try to do a nice bit of an overview in different categories. And I hope that this added to your knowledge of this subject. Maybe you learned something new. So if there's something that somebody wants to share with me or ask questions, I'm happy to do that. So comments.
Wow.
No? Nobody? Here, I guess I'll stop sharing my screen. Sure, I can do that. Hold on. I can figure out. You'd think by now there we go. Stop share. Anybody have any? Oh, maybe I can take everybody off mute. Maybe I have to do that. Hold on. Participants. Allow participants. Yes, I'm going to. Oh, were you all on mute and you couldn't unmute yourselves the whole time? Wait, are you? Okay, I think you can talk now if you want.
I don't know, it looks like everyone is on mute.
Okay, I think, wait, hold on. Allow participants to, I just clicked it. You should be able to unmute yourself if you want. Does somebody? Want?
Yes.
Did someone have a question?
Comment.
Thought I heard someone. If people are not asking now, you can think about what what we've heard, and we can always convey questions and contact Lori. But think a minute if anyone has any questions in these last few moments.
Also, is there anything in your museum that touched upon what we discussed today? Of course, there's somebody in the audience who knows I get a hold of me, so you don't have a problem with that. If you think of something later, that's not a problem. But
I have a question, just a small detail.
okay, hopefully I can answer. Yeah.
The photograph of the orchestra, I think it was in the Vilna ghetto.
Of the what? The orchestra. Yeah. That was in the Lodge ghetto.
The Lodge ghetto. Okay. They brought the uniforms with them. They didn't construct them there, did they? What can you tell me about that?
I do not know. I don't know what resources they had available. They were all allowed to bring, I mean, think about it, they also carried their instruments with them. And many times when moving into the ghettos, they could only carry X amount. I would assume that musicians took their stuff with them. But I don't know for sure. That I could try and see if I find that information. But I don't know how to answer right off the top of my head. Yeah. I don't know if we have that answer, but I can look into it and see.
Not important. It was just a
curiosity. It's an interesting thought. I will tell you, for example, I'll give you an example. In Theresienstadt, has anybody ever heard of Friedel Dicker Brandeis?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know if you know her. She was married but without children, if I'm not mistaken. And when they were given, I believe it was 50 pounds to bring in, she brought in, from what we're told, all art supplies. That's what she brought in. And she was, again, we talk about pioneers. Thank you. That was probably the word I was looking for when I forgot my English. We talk about pioneers like Emanuel Ringelblum and women's studies. She was really a pioneer, if you think about it, in art therapy. She anticipated the children going through difficult times when she was being taken from her home. So I can only imagine. And she packed a suitcase basically almost of all art supplies. So we know that. Do I know about the uniforms? I don't, but I could see if there's information about it. But it's an interesting thought.
Again, thank you so much. And if anyone has further questions, we will get them to Lori and hopefully answers back. Thank you all, and hope you can join us this evening for Rebecca Belding.
And thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was very good.
Thank you. It was
good
excellent
presentation.
Thank you.
That's great.